welcome the director, Josh Oppenheimer.
So all last autumn, we held screenings at the National Human Rights Commission in Jakarta for Indonesia's leading filmmakers, celebrities, journalists, artists, intellectuals, historians, and human rights advocates, and of course survivors groups. Everybody who saw the film said this film must be shown immediately to everyone in Indonesia, and we encourage people to take the film back to their networks and hold invitation-only screenings, because a film which is screened at a closed screening need not be submitted to the censors before the screening officially. Indonesia is sufficiently lawless that that might not have held, but we hoped that it would. On December 10th last year, International Human Rights Day, all these people who'd seen the film at the National Human Rights Commission in Jakarta went and held screenings. There were 50 screenings in 30 cities on that day, averaging in size about 200 people each, so they were closed but large. And within, that then grew from there. From 10,000 people seeing it the first day, that grew to the summer when over 1,100 screenings had been held in 118 cities. Almost all of those screenings were public. And the reason for that shift was because of the media's response to the film. The film has fundamentally changed the way the media talks about Indonesia's past and the way they talk about corruption, impunity, and thuggery that's built on the unresolved trauma of that past in the present. The film has come to Indonesia like the child, I would say, in The Emperor's New Clothes, pointing at the king and saying, look, the king is naked. Everybody knew it, but had been too afraid to say it, too afraid to speak of it. Now that it's said so powerfully by the perpetrators themselves, there's no going back. So I would say the film has opened a space for survivors and human rights groups to demand a truth commission, to demand a reconciliation process, and to articulate what kind of justice they want for the first time and without fear. Word got out we were interested in the genocide. When that happened, the army would no longer let the survivors with whom we were living participate in the film anymore. So the survivors said, okay, these army people who aren't allowing you to talk, aren't allowing us to talk, or aren't allowing us to film with you, are fairly low ranking. But living in this same village are fairly powerful perpetrators, death squad leaders, who these soldiers will not dare stop from talking. So if they will talk, if the perpetrators will talk, maybe you can find out how our relatives died. So we approached these perpetrators on behalf of the survivors with real temerity at first. We were afraid, we didn't know if it was safe to approach them. But to our astonishment, all of them immediately opened up with these grotesque, grisly accounts, boastful accounts of mass killing, which they would tell with a smile on their face in front of their wives, their children, even their grandchildren. And in this contrast between perpetrators who were boasting about things far more incriminating than anything the survivors could have said, and survivors who were forced into silence, I felt as though I'd wandered into Germany 40 years after the Holocaust, only to find the Nazis still in power. And what made that all the worse was the sense from my experience on the plantation that this is not some freakish aberration unique to Indonesia. This is the norm across the global south, where there's been mass political violence, often sponsored by the United States or the West in general. And in the victory of the perpetrators, victors' histories have been written that are used to keep people afraid. Too afraid. The people who make everything we buy, in fact, are kept too afraid or too suppressed to get the human cost of what we buy included in the price tag that we pay. So this situation made me feel that I would give as many years of my life as it would take to address it. I took that first material with those perpetrators from this small plantation village back to those survivors who wanted to see it, and to the Indonesian human rights community. All of them said, this is so important. You're onto something so important. Keep filming the perpetrators, because any Indonesian who sees this will be forced to acknowledge the rotten heart of this whole regime, and will be forced to acknowledge that we're all afraid and why. And so, feeling entrusted by the survivors and the human rights community, I filmed every perpetrator I could find, starting from that plantation village, working my way up the chain of command from the countryside to the city. I spent 2 years doing that. Anwar was the 41st perpetrator I filmed. The scene on the roof at the beginning was the very first day I met him. The scene at the end of the film was the very last day I filmed with him. 5 years later, 1,200 hours of footage later. And all of these perpetrators were boastful and would take me to the places they killed, launch into spontaneous demonstrations of how they killed, complain that they hadn't thought to bring along a machete, for example, to use as a prop, or a friend to play a victim. And after filming maybe 10 men go through this, I stopped being as curious about what they did, because it was very much of a pattern. But I started to want to understand, why are they boasting? For whom are they boasting? How do they want to be seen? How do they see themselves? And so I proposed to them very directly, look, you've participated in one of the biggest killings in human history. Your whole society's built on it. Your life is shaped by it. I want to know what it means to you. You want to show me what you've done. So show me what you've done in whatever way you wish. I will film your process. I will film any reenactments you create. And I will film you discussing with your friends what you should show, what you should not show, and why. And thereby answer these questions: how you want to be seen, how you see yourself, what this means to you, what this means to your society. So I'll say that I lingered on Anwar because his pain was close to the surface. And I started to intuit, I think it took a while before I really grasped it, but I intuited that perhaps all this boasting I'd spent 2 years filming and documenting as a manifestation of impunity was in fact not a sign of pride, not a sign that these men lack conscience, but the opposite, a desperate attempt to convince themselves that what they did was right, so that they could wake up in the morning, look in the mirror, and see a human being rather than a murderer. Herman not only loves the film, but has distanced himself from Panchasila youth and is one of the only people to hold public screenings of the film in Medan, the city where it was made. Anwar's reaction is perhaps most important. He saw it just over a year ago, was very moved by it. He was tearful, he was silent for a long time. Finally he said, "Josh, this film shows what it is like to be me. And I'm grateful, I'm relieved to have been able to show what this means. Having spent a lifetime talking about what I did, no one ever wants to hear what it really means." There's a moment in the car with Adi where he says, if the truth comes out, it's bad for it may be true what you're finding, but it's bad. And I say, well, for the millions of families of victims, if the truth comes out, it's good. Thereby saying, this is where I stand on this side. I think I tried to be as open as I could without endangering my crew. I have a wonderful anonymous Indonesian crew, one of whom is one of my very dearest friends, who I have credited as a co-director on the film. These are people who gave 8 years of their lives to make this film with me, risking their safety, knowing they wouldn't be able to put their names on the film unless there's real political change in Indonesia, which is yet to arrive. So there were times like during the village massacre scene where I was horrified but could not show that because there were 100 paramilitaries and the army, and I couldn't safely say what I felt in that moment. But I tried to be as honest as I could. There was a very powerful experience in London. I had a screening of the film, and a man a Chinese Indonesian who was living in London came up to me after the film and said, in tears, and he said he'd been crying from somewhere in the middle of the film on to the end, unable to stop, not because of what happened in the film, but because at some point making the film, he realized that his father, who he was told died of a disease when he was little, that his father had been killed. And he doesn't know what it was in the film that made him realize that. And yet, once it hit him, he knew it with a certainty. Like all these signs in his mother's subtext over his childhood made it clear that this had happened. And he just was grieving for his father throughout the whole screening. A group of survivors had been trying to visit a mass grave. It's mandatory for Muslim Indonesians to visit the grave, pay respects to their dead ancestors' relatives towards the end of Ramadan. And they would try and go and visit a mass grave in central Java. And the paramilitary group locally, like Pancasila Youth, wouldn't allow them to come, would beat them up if they tried to go visit the grave. a group of children of perpetrators and survivors, I have no idea why they had this awful idea, decided to screen the film at the mass grave. And I would never propose screening this film at a mass grave, but they did. And after that, as a result of that, for the first time, or after that, as a result of that, survivors and the children of the perpetrators now visit that mass grave together and pay respects. So this film, the kind of pain, trauma, and potential for recognizing the mutual humanity of people who've been on opposite sides of an issue that this film has catalyzed has been absolutely the most important and most fulfilling part of releasing the act of killing.
I want to thank you very much for coming, and thanks especially to Joshua Oppenheimer.